Hello there. Welcome to Write Better Stories. My name is Daniel Backer. This is my son Lawrence. And before we start today, you might notice that my tree is gone. It was covered in bugs, so I took it outside and I nuked it with a pesticide, and I'm hoping to be able to bring it back because I liked it for the frame of the video and just for the environment in my room. But I was waking up with bug bites and I quickly discovered that there's a shit ton of bugs in my tree. But today we're going to talk about prose, so this might lean a little bit more toward fiction writers, but I think that there is an application for those of you who are writing scripts as well, because the traditional advice for both fiction and for scripts is that you should just have the most sparse, utilitarian prose as possible. That would be descriptions for scripts. But I've seen fantastic examples of people who completely ignore that advice to great effect. So I think that this is a little bit even more heresy for scripts, but you're still having somebody read the script. You know, you want to engage them and really put them inside of your scene, and so I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you're just trying to be as cut and dry as possible, just get it done. And I get the intention behind that advice. You don't want to indulge into flowery language just for its own sake. However, so many good writers, that's what makes them what they are, is lengthy descriptions, really long sentences, giving them the opportunity to indulge a little bit more in their mastery of language. If you take a book like Ulysses, which I'll admit I've only read a couple pages of, it wouldn't be what it is if you told him not to really at length describe things. That's one of the best parts about reading, I think, is that you do get the opportunity, since words are your medium, to, indulge in the language a little bit more. Now, I think the obvious thing is that you don't want to indulge in it just for its own sake. So I remember in my English major in particular, there's this idea of people describing something that doesn't really benefit the story at all. So for example, somebody might write something like, "She walked up the steps gingerly, placing each foot as delicately as if she was making gingerbread cookies." Unless this character has a really important attachment to walking or steps or staircases or gingerbread cookies, there's no real reason to devote this kind of description to just her traveling from one floor of the house to the other. So I think that should be the focus, rather than on not doing flowery language. It should just be on, does the flowery language serve a purpose? Does it actually contribute to your scene or to your story? Or are you just indulging in the language? So I heard in an improv class, or actually one of my friends was in an improv class, and they told me that one of their teachers said, sometimes you have to service the scene, but sometimes they want to see MJ dunk. So I think this is how you can think of writing prose. Yes, you should be servicing the scene and doing the craft correctly, but this is an artistic medium too, where you are allowed to have a little bit of fun. Sometimes you do gotta dunk the basketball and do something just for show, or I guess not just for show. You still get a point when you dunk a basketball, but it is for show definitely as well. So I'm going to take an example today from the book V by Thomas Pynchon. This is an awesome book that is very, very difficult to describe what it's about because it's so sprawling, and there's several different threads that he's working with inside of the book. But one of the best things about Thomas Pynchon is his prose. He can really write these crazy paragraphs and these crazy sentences that make all of these comments about society and history and the characters. And to be fair, his plots are maybe not the best thing to read if you're trying to learn plotting, because they're just so ridiculous. They're pretty crazy. To my understanding, he was inspired by a lot of detective fiction, and detective fiction in general, a lot of noirs, do have very complicated plots, which is something I've mentioned in another episode, of basically people just going to one character and then they tell them one story, and then that makes them go to another character and talk to that person who told them that the last character they talked to was lying, and it is just this kind of labyrinth. So again, I recommend everybody at least try to read Thomas Pynchon. I don't think he's for everybody, but he is a great example of somebody that just has a mastery of the language. And so This is not following the advice at all of using economy of words, the most utilitarian way of describing things. He really indulges in a lot of more flowery language. So rather than me describe it, let me read a short paragraph from V. Eigenvalue, by the way, is the name of one of the characters. And yeah, I won't get into that too much in here because it's really more about the prose than about the character. But it says, perhaps history this century, thought Eigenvalue, is rippled with gathers in its fabric such that if it were situated, as Stencil seemed to be, Stencil is another character, at the bottom of a fold, it's impossible to determine warp, woof, or pattern anywhere else. By virtue, however, of existing in one gather, it is assumed that there are others, compartmented off into sinuous cycles, each of which come to assume greater importance than the weave itself and destroys any continuity. Thus, it is that we are charmed by the funny-looking automobiles of the 30s, the curious fashions of the 20s, the peculiar moral habits of our grandparents. We produce and attend musical comedies about them, and we are conned into a false memory, a phony nostalgia about what they were. We are accordingly lost to any sense of a continuous tradition. Perhaps if we lived on a crest, things would be different. We could at least see. So, that is definitely, you could call some indulgent language, but I think that it definitely serves a purpose. He ends up talking about a theme inside of the book, which is this sort of construction of history, that what we think of as memory or history is just the account of somebody who wrote it down from their particular perspective, and about how different time periods can seem very foreign to us, whereas at the time it just seems like the way that everything is. And I would say that that is a pretty common sentiment of a lot of the postmodern writers, or just the postmodern ethic in general, and I'll probably do a longer video on that at some point. But just this idea of what we take to be normal is actually a construction that is rooted in a particular perspective rather than the actual normal or the way that things are. But let's look a little bit more closely at this prose, because he does this extended metaphor with fabric to sort of represent the timeline and people's place in it. So, perhaps history this century, thought Eigenvalue, is rippled with gathers in its fabric such that if we are situated, as Stencil seemed to be, at the bottom of a fold, it's impossible to determine warp, woof, or pattern anywhere else. So, that metaphor is pretty cool, because it shows that you imagine yourself being inside of this twisted up piece of fabric, almost like a wrinkly bed sheet, and you're inside of maybe one of the little valleys, which I'm pretty sure is what the word woof means in this context, warp or woof. That if you are inside of a valley, you can't really see outside of it, and so it's, but you can, well, I'll get to that in a moment, but yeah, you're basically situated down in this little crevice, and you can see around yourself, but everything outside of it is obscured by the walls of the fabric to you. Now he continues, by virtue, however, of existing in one gather, it is assumed that there are others, compartmented off into sinuous cycles, each of which comes to assume greater importance than the weave itself, and destroys any continuity. So this is basically surmising that if you are inside of a little valley inside of the fabric, that there are more like that go in their different patterns and their different ways of orienting themselves. And he says that they are compartmented off into sinuous cycles, each of which come to assume greater importance than the weave itself. So he's basically denying that there is any larger knowable pattern to any of these different pieces or valleys within the fabric. Which again, I think really supports that theme that's common to a lot of postmodernism, is that, yeah, there's no larger explanation of what history is. I think that is a pretty common theme there, because it's easy for us to look at it through one lens. If you just say, oh, it's all evolution, or it's all, as Marx described, a battle between the classes. That's in a lot of ways what the postmodernists were reacting to, that sort of grand narrative of history. And he really brings that sort of lofty description down to earth here, in saying that specifically that they're compartmented off into sinuous cycles, each of which come to assume greater importance than the weave itself and destroys any continuity. Specifically that that it destroys any continuity. We can't really look at our time period in particular, or our piece and valley of the fabric, to assume anything larger about those other times. And so this, he sort of brings it down to earth a little bit, breaking from that fabric metaphor just for a moment, in order to say, thus it is we are charmed by the funny-looking automobiles of the 30s, the curious fashions of the 20s, and the peculiar moral habits of our grandparents. This is where he's saying that if you were able to sort of peek into another area of that larger fabric of time, you can see it is so different from the way that things are now. It feels like a different world. And so he goes on to say, we produce and attend musical comedies about them and are conned into a false memory, a phony nostalgia about what they were. This, again, very common postmodern theme, supporting that thing that I was talking about, that what we have of it, when we see that photo of people wearing the big crazy hats in the 1920s and the different automobiles of the 1930s, it's a construction. We didn't really know, or we don't know what it would have felt like for that to have been the actual normal. That's what he means by calling it that phony nostalgia. And we are accordingly lost to any sense of a continuous tradition. Same thing. If we perhaps lived on a crest, things would be different. We could at least see. Now, this is a sort of interesting thing that I think you could argue maybe breaks with that critique of a more continuous interpretation of history, that if we weren't situated down inside of one of the valleys or the particular subjective experience of our time period, maybe we would be able to see a larger pattern to history. Maybe there would be a narrative that would let us understand everything, which is what he means by the last line, at least I think. We could at least see. So maybe we might not know it, but we'd be able to see, oh, this is how everything comes together. So I guess I did get into a little bit more of analyzing the theme of that paragraph, but I think this is a perfect example of, it's not really scenic. You know, he's taking a moment to sort of exit the narrative. And granted, it is situated in the character's perspective, like it says at the beginning of the paragraph. Perhaps history this century, thought eigenvalue. But this is, again, more of a summary of history itself. He's really taking this opportunity to just talk about what he wanted to talk about. He's sort of injecting the theme at that moment. And if he had just been trying to do something scenic or describing the environment, I don't think it would have been quite as interesting, and it really wouldn't make it what it is. So I think something that's important to say here is that if you do indulge in some of these longer trysts out into description like this, you really want to make sure that you have your sentence structure down. Something that happens to me a lot when I try to write lengthier sentences and lengthier paragraphs that go in that direction is that I'll accidentally do a lot of misplaced modifiers. And so an example of a misplaced modifier would be like, the sun shone down on Charlie, smiling pleasantly. Now that seems to make sense unless you look at it a little bit more closely, because it makes it sound like the sun is smiling pleasantly, which what I meant by that is Charlie is smiling pleasantly. So I'll say it again. The sun shone down on Charlie, smiling pleasantly. So if you stack a bunch of these clauses together, you can accidentally use those participial phrases and gerund phrases to refer to the subject of the sentence instead of the object of the sentence. So maybe you could rewrite that sentence to say something along the lines of, Charlie was smiling pleasantly as the sun shone down on him. You just want to make sure that everything is right in a row, and that just comes with practice. It helps to read up on grammar a little bit too, so that you don't cause that confusion. But again, I hope that was a good example for you guys and gals of prose that doesn't adhere to that stricter advice about just being utilitarian. Books, I think, really lend themselves to getting into that more interesting territory where you just go, but again, don't make it flowery for its own sake. Make it flowery with a purpose. I don't like the idea of putting any kind of restrictions on that kind of thing, but I think this is especially true in a first draft. You don't want to be sitting there writing thinking, oh, is it too flowery or not? The first draft, just go. Make it as flowery and big and grand as you can, and really indulge in a lot of that stuff, because that is I think what makes a lot of people excited to start writing in the first place is getting into those more poetic descriptions of things. And then if in the editing process you realize it's a little too much, you can cut away some of that description and sort of carve out a little bit more of an economical way of telling your story. But just to sum everything up, I don't like the idea of sparse utilitarian prose as the rule. That can be the solution to over-flowery language, but I want to see some cool descriptions out there. So hopefully that will help you write better stories, fiction writers and script writers alike. And Lawrence for his bird stories. He's got a little seed stuck on his beak. But yeah, please like and subscribe. Leave me any comments if you'd like. And that's all I got for you. Thank you.